Montana Territory, 1882. The setting sun painted the valley in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the rolling plains where Hawk Creek met the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. Hannah Sutton stood on the porch of her family's modest homestead, her delicate hands gripping the weathered railing as she stared at the horizon. At 20 years old, with flowing chestnut hair that caught the dying light and eyes the color of summer sage, Hannah had learned one truth about the frontier: the West took more than it gave. She smoothed the simple blue calico dress that had seen better days, much like the homestead itself. Her father had been 3 months in the ground, taken by fever that swept through the territory that spring. Her mother had followed 2 weeks later. Hannah's older brother had left for California gold fields years ago, leaving her to manage what remained of their struggling cattle operation alone. "No one finds happiness out here," Hannah whispered to the wind. "Only survival." It was the belief that had taken root in her heart since watching her mother's pine coffin lowered into the unforgiving Montana soil. Love was a luxury the frontier couldn't sustain, a frivolous notion for people back east with parlors and pianos and prospects. Out here, attachment only made the inevitable losses harder to bear. What Hannah needed was practical help with the cattle, not daydreams. The Sutton spread was small but strategic, controlling vital water access that larger operations coveted. Without her father's steady hand, the neighboring ranches had begun pushing boundaries, accidentally, allowing cattle to graze on Sutton land. She had hired hands, but they were temporary men with temporary loyalty. Hannah knew they whispered that a woman couldn't hold the land for long. She would prove them wrong. She had to. The sound of hoofbeats broke the evening stillness. Hannah shaded her eyes against the sinking sun, watching as a lone rider approached from the northern ridge. The silhouette was unfamiliar, not one of her hands returning late from the north pasture. Her hand instinctively moved to the shotgun propped beside the door. The rider slowed his mount to a walk as he approached, and Hannah got her first clear look at him. He sat tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered yet lean, with a straight back that spoke of confidence without arrogance. As he drew closer, she could see he was young, perhaps 25, with a face that would have been handsome even without the striking blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His jaw was strong but clean-shaven, unusual for men who worked the range, and his light brown hair curled slightly beneath a dust-covered hat. "Evening, ma'am," he called, stopping his horse a respectful distance from the porch. "Name's Bryce Foster. I heard you might be looking for hands." Hannah squared her shoulders. "Who told you that?" "Station master in Helena. Said the Sutton place lost its owner and might need help with the spring drive." He paused, studying her with those penetrating eyes. "I didn't realize I'd be speaking with Miss Sutton herself." "Mrs. Sutton was my mother," Hannah replied, the shotgun still within reach. "She's gone now, too." A shadow crossed his face. "My condolences. Losing family out here, it's never easy." Something in his tone suggested personal knowledge of such loss, but Hannah wasn't interested in sharing grief with a stranger. "Are you experienced with cattle?" "Yes, ma'am. Work drives from Texas to Wyoming. Good with horses, better with cattle, and I can mend most anything that breaks." There was no boast in his words, just simple statement of fact. Hannah's eyes narrowed. Men like him, young, capable, usually worked for the big outfits where pay was steady. Why come to a small spread like this? "Big outfits have big problems," he said, one corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Too many men fighting to prove themselves, too many bosses with different ideas. I prefer working where my effort makes a difference." It was a good answer, too good, perhaps. Hannah had learned to distrust smooth words, but she couldn't deny she needed help, especially with someone who knew more than the local boy she'd hired. "I can offer room, board, and 30 a month," she said firmly. "The bunkhouse is down by the corrals. We start at dawn." Bryce nodded, touching the brim of his hat. "Fair enough, Miss Sutton." "Hannah," she corrected automatically, then immediately regretted the familiarity. "Hannah," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her stomach tighten unexpectedly. "I'll get settled, then. See you at dawn." As he rode toward the bunkhouse, Hannah gripped the railing tighter. Men came and went on the frontier, following work or rumors of gold, or simply the restless push westward. Bryce Foster would be no different. She would use his skills while she had them, and when he left, as they all eventually did, she would continue on alone. That was the only certainty the frontier offered. The first week passed in a blur of activity. Spring brought calving season, and Hannah found herself grudgingly impressed by Bryce's tireless work ethic. He seemed to need little sleep, rising before dawn and often continuing long after the other hands retired to the bunkhouse. More importantly, the cattle responded to him with unusual calm. On the 8th day, disaster struck when a late-season storm blew in from the north, driving temperatures down and threatening the newly born calves. Hannah had been checking fence lines when the weather changed, and she found herself caught 2 miles from the homestead as sleep began to fall. Her horse slipped on the increasingly treacherous ground, sending Hannah tumbling into the mud. Pain shot through her ankle as she landed awkwardly, and the panicked horse bolted toward home. The sleet turned to driving snow as Hannah limped along, the temperature plummeting with each passing minute. Her thin coat provided little protection against the biting wind. Numbness crept into her fingers and toes, and the rational part of her mind recognized the danger of her situation. People died in such storms every year. It was another way the frontier claimed its due. Through the curtain of white, a dark shape emerged. For a wild moment, Hannah thought it might be a bear or mountain lion drawn by her vulnerability. But then Bryce's voice cut through the howl of the wind. "Hannah, thank God." He was off his horse in an instant, wrapping his heavy coat around her shoulders before she could protest. His hands were warm as they chafed, feeling back into her frozen fingers. "How did you find me?" she managed through chattering teeth. "Your horse came back riderless. I knew which section you were checking." He frowned at her ankle. "Can you ride?" When she nodded, he lifted her onto his horse with surprising gentleness, then mounted behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, and Hannah found herself leaning back against his chest, drawn to his warmth like a moth to flame. "I've got you," he murmured near her ear as they started toward home. "You're safe now." Those simple words broke something loose inside her. No one had told Hannah she was safe since her father died. No one had put her welfare above their own. Out here, everyone looked after themselves first. That was the law of survival she'd accepted. Yet here was this man she barely knew, riding out into a dangerous storm to find her, giving her his coat while he faced the full brunt of the elements. Back at the homestead, Bryce carried her into the house despite her protests that she could walk. He built up the fire while Hannah changed into dry clothes, then insisted on examining her ankle. "It's just a sprain," he said, his touch clinical but gentle as he wrapped it tight. "You should stay off it for a few days." Hannah laughed bitterly. "There's no staying off it during calving season. The hands and I can manage. You need to rest." "Why do you care?" The question burst from her before she could stop it. Bryce looked up, surprise evident in those blue eyes. "Why wouldn't I?" "Because people out here look after themselves. That's how it works. That's how we survive." He was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on her ankle. "Is that what you believe? That we're all just alone out here? Isn't it true?" Hannah challenged. "People come and go. They die or leave, or both. Caring just makes it harder when they do." Something shifted in his expression, understanding, perhaps, or recognition. "That's a lonely way to live, Hannah." "It's a realistic way to live," she countered. But even as she said it, something inside her rebelled against the words. Bryce shook his head slowly. "I don't think the frontier makes us more alone. I think it shows us how much we need each other." He finished wrapping her ankle and rose to his feet. "Rest. I'll check on you in the morning." After he left, Hannah stared into the flames of the fireplace, unsettled by both his words and the warmth that lingered where his hands had been. Over the next few weeks, Hannah found her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. Though she'd insisted on returning to work despite her injured ankle, Bryce had rearranged duties so she could manage without aggravating the sprain. More surprising was how he'd taken an interest in her ideas for improving the ranch's operations. "Your father had good water rights here," he noted one evening as they sat on the porch, reviewing the day's work. "With the right management, you could double your herd in 2 years." "That takes capital I don't have," Hannah responded. "True, but the banker in Helena might see things differently if you presented a solid plan." He outlined a strategy that made practical sense, building on strengths she hadn't recognized. It was disorienting to be taken seriously, to have her thoughts and plans respected rather than dismissed because of her gender or youth. Even more disorienting was the way Bryce had begun to feature in her thoughts at odd moments throughout the day. She would catch herself watching him work, the fluid strength in his movements, the easy way he handled skittish animals, the smile that transformed his face when something amused him. Hannah told herself it was merely appreciation for a capable employee, nothing more. Until the night of the spring drive celebration. The cattle had been moved successfully to summer pastures, and as was tradition, Hannah had given the hands permission for a small gathering. Someone produced a fiddle, another a harmonica, and soon the yard was filled with music and laughter. Hannah stood apart, watching her hands enjoy the brief respite from work. She wore her one good dress, a modest green cotton that her mother had helped her sew 2 years prior. Her hair was loose down her back, still damp from washing. "May I have this dance?" Bryce appeared at her side, hand extended. In the firelight, his eyes seemed darker, more intense. "I don't dance," Hannah said automatically. "Everyone dances," he countered with that half-smile. "Some just need reminding how." Before she could form another objection, his hand was at her waist, and Hannah found herself being guided into the simple steps of a country reel. She was stiff at first, too conscious of the eyes of the other hands, too aware of Bryce's palm against her back. "Relax," he murmured. "The frontier won't collapse if Hannah Sutton enjoys herself for one evening." The gentle teasing in his voice drew a reluctant smile from her. "You're very sure of yourself, Mr. Foster." "Only about some things." His eyes held hers as they turned through the steps, like knowing when someone deserves a moment of happiness. The music shifted to a slower melody, and Hannah knew she should step away. Instead, she allowed Bryce to draw her closer, their steps becoming less a formal dance and more a simple swaying to the mournful notes of the fiddle. "Why did you really come here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you. I prefer smaller spreads. There's more to it than that." He was quiet for a moment, and Hannah thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was lower, meant only for her ears. "I was riding with a big outfit in Wyoming. The owner's son took a disliking to me. Thought I was rising too fast in his father's estimation. He started a stampede, blamed it on me. A good man died." His jaw tightened at the memory. "I couldn't prove it wasn't my fault. Word spreads fast in this business. No big ranch would hire me after that. So I was your last resort," Hannah said, trying to ignore the disappointment that flooded her. "No." Bryce's hand tightened slightly on her waist. "You were a new beginning. I could have gone back east, started over completely. But I chose to come here." "Why?" The question hung between them, weighted with meanings Hannah wasn't ready to acknowledge. Bryce's eyes searched hers, and for a moment she thought he might close the small distance between them. Instead, a gunshot shattered the night. The music stopped abruptly as riders thundered into the yard. 6 men, heavily armed, their faces concealed by bandanas. Hannah recognized the leader immediately despite his mask. Frank Milligan, foreman of the Circle M, the largest spread in the valley. They'd been pressuring her to sell since her father's death. "Evening, Miss Sutton," Milligan called, his tone mockingly polite. "Quite a celebration you're having." Hannah felt Bryce tense beside her, but she stepped forward, away from his protective stance. "State your business, Milligan." "Just delivering a message." He gestured, and his men spread out, surrounding the small group of ranch hands. "Mr. Murray is tired of waiting for you to see reason. He's offering to buy your spread, one last time. Fair price, cash money." "The Sutton Ranch isn't for sale," Hannah replied evenly, though her heart hammered in her chest. "Now get off my land." Milligan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's unfortunate. Because strange things happen to stubborn folks out here. Fires, cattle stampedes, accidents." His gaze shifted to Bryce. Even good hands can meet with tragedy. The threat hung in the air like the smell before a storm. Hannah's hands clenched at her sides, fury warring with fear. Before she could respond, Bryce stepped up beside her. "I believe the lady asked you to leave," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And who might you be?" Milligan asked. "Someone who doesn't take kindly to threats against women." Milligan laughed. "Big talk from a hired gun with nowhere else to go." "Oh yes, we know who you are, Foster. The man who got Jake Wilson killed in Wyoming. No one will hire you after this place falls, and fall it will." Hannah felt as though she'd been plunged into ice water. How could Milligan know about Wyoming? Unless Bryce had been sent here deliberately. Unless everything. His arrival, his help, his apparent interest in her, was part of a plan to gain her trust while Milligan and his employer maneuvered to take her land. The betrayal cut deeper than she would have believed possible. "Get out," she said, her voice barely audible. For a moment, Bryce thought she was speaking to Milligan, until he saw the look in her eyes. "Get out," she repeated, louder this time, her gaze fixed on him. "Both of you. All of you. Now." Milligan smirked beneath his bandana. "Think on our offer, Miss Sutton. We'll be back for your answer tomorrow." He wheeled his horse around, and his men followed, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. In the silence that followed, Bryce turned to Hannah. "It's not what you think, isn't it? You show up right when I'm most vulnerable, gain my trust, learn all about my operation. The pieces fit too perfectly. Was any of it real? Or was it all just part of your job? Hannah, I swear to you, don't." She stepped back, rebuilding the walls that had begun to crumble. "Just don't. I was a fool to think, to believe." She straightened her shoulders. "You have until morning to collect your things." Hannah turned and walked into the house, closing the door firmly behind her. Only then, with no one to witness, did she allow the tears to fall. Dawn came with a crimson sky that promised more heat. Hannah had barely slept, alternating between rage at Bryce's betrayal and fury at herself for being so easily deceived. She'd led him past her defenses, shared her plans, even begun to imagine a future that included him. The thought made her cheeks burn with shame. She was in the barn, saddling her horse to ride the fence line, when she heard footsteps behind her. Hannah knew without turning that it was Bryce. "I told you to leave," she said, not looking up from her work. "I know." His voice was quiet. "And I will, if that's what you truly want. But not until you hear me out." Hannah turned, keeping the saddle between them like a barrier. "There's nothing to hear. Milligan made it perfectly clear why you're here." "Milligan is a liar." Bryce's eyes held her steadily. "Yes, I left Wyoming under a cloud. Yes, good ranches wouldn't hire me. But I wasn't sent here to undermine you, Hannah. I came because I heard a woman was trying to hold on to her family's land alone, and I thought I could help. A convenient story. It's the truth." He stepped closer, his expression earnest. "Think about it. If I were working for Murray, why would I have helped improve your operation? Why would I have shown you how to maximize your water rights, the very thing he wants most from this land?" Hannah faltered. It was true that Bryce had helped strengthen her position, not weaken it. Then how did Milligan know about Wyoming? "Because Murray has connections. He probably sent telegrams asking about me as soon as I arrived." Bryce's jaw tightened. "They want you isolated, Hannah. Alone and vulnerable. That's why Milligan came last night. Not to threaten you, but to drive a wedge between us." And it had worked. Hannah had reacted exactly as they'd hoped, pushing away her strongest ally in a moment of doubt. The realization was bitter. "Even if that's true," she said slowly, "it doesn't change the fact that Murray won't stop coming for this land. He has men, money, and the territorial judge in his pocket. Then we fight him on ground of our choosing." Bryce's eyes lit with determination. "We can send telegrams to the territorial governor. Alert the newspaper in Helena. Make enough noise that Murray can't simply make you disappear." "We?" Hannah questioned, the word hanging between them. "Yes, we. If you'll have me." He took another step forward, closing the distance. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone, Hannah. Not unless you order me off this land again, and mean it this time." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. There was something raw and honest there, something that couldn't be feigned. Hannah had grown up reading people. It was a necessary skill on the frontier. And everything in Bryce's expression spoke of sincerity. More than that, it spoke of something deeper that neither had put into words. "Stay," she said finally. "We'll face Murray together." The relief that washed over his face was genuine, and Hannah felt an answering lightness in her chest. Perhaps she was making another mistake in trusting him. But for the first time since her parents died, the thought of facing her battles with someone at her side felt right. What Hannah couldn't know was that Murray had no intention of waiting for her answer. That very afternoon, while she and Bryce were meeting with her remaining loyal hands to develop a strategy, Milligan and his men were putting their own plan into action. They started the fire in the north pasture, where the spring grass was driest. With the wind blowing south toward the homestead, it wouldn't take long for the flames to threaten everything Hannah had fought to preserve. The first warning was the smell of smoke carried on the breeze. Bryce noticed it first, his head lifting as he sniffed the air. "Fire," he said, alarm sharpening his voice. They rushed outside to see a wall of orange flame advancing across the northern pasture, driven by the wind directly toward the house and outbuildings. Worse, the cattle in the home pasture were beginning to panic, sensing the approaching danger. "Milligan," Hannah breathed, rage and fear mingling in her voice. There was no time for recriminations. Bryce was already shouting orders, organizing the hands to fight the blaze and move the cattle to safety. Hannah ran for the barn, grabbing shovels, buckets, and wet burlap sacks. The next hours passed in a nightmarish blur of smoke, heat, and exhaustion. They dug fire breaks, beat back flames with wet sacks, and struggled to keep the terrified cattle from stampeding. The smoke was so thick that breathing became painful, and Hannah lost sight of Bryce several times in the chaos. Just when it seemed they might contain the worst of the blaze, Hannah heard gunshots from the direction of the house. She ran back through the smoke, coughing and stumbling, to find Milligan and two of his men ransacking her home. They had already broken open her father's desk and were searching for the deed to the property. "Stop," Hannah shouted, raising her shotgun. Milligan turned, his expression contemptuous. "Drop it, girl. You're outnumbered. Not as much as you think." Bryce's voice came from behind Hannah as he stepped through the door, his own revolver drawn. Two of Hannah's loyal hands appeared at the windows, their rifles trained on Murray's men. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Milligan's eyes narrowed. "You think this changes anything? Murray will have this land, one way or another. He owns the territory." "Not anymore," came a new voice from the doorway. Hannah turned to see a tall man in a dusty suit, flanked by several armed men wearing badges. "United States Marshal James Cooper," the man announced. "And you boys are under arrest for arson, attempted theft, and threatening a landowner." Milligan's face drained of color. "On whose authority?" "The territorial governor's." The marshal held up a telegram. "Seems he received some interesting reports about coercion and illegal land grabs in this valley. Decided to send me to investigate." He nodded toward Bryce. "Thanks for your telegram, Foster. Arrived just in time." Hannah's eyes widened as she looked at Bryce. "You contacted the marshal?" "Yesterday, after Milligan's visit." Bryce's gaze never left the gunman as he spoke. "I hoped they'd arrive before Murray made his move, but I'm glad they're here now." As the marshals took Milligan and his men into custody, the full impact of what had happened began to sink in. Hannah stepped outside to see that the fire was finally under control, though much of the north pasture was burned. The house and barn still stood, and most of the cattle had been saved. But more importantly, Murray's hold over the valley was broken. With federal marshals investigating his operations, his days of intimidation were over. "I can't believe you did this," Hannah said when she and Bryce were finally alone on the porch as evening fell. "Did what?" "Contacted the marshal. Stood by me. Risked everything." Her voice caught. "No one's fought for me like that since my father died." Bryce's expression softened as he looked at her. "You're worth fighting for, Hannah Sutton." He hesitated, then reached out to brush a smudge of soot from her cheek. "I've known it since the first day I rode onto this land." The tenderness in his touch broke something open inside her, a dam of emotion she'd held back for too long. Tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the ash and dirt that covered her face. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've been alone so long. I've lost everyone I've ever loved. I don't know if I can bear to lose anyone else." Bryce drew her gently into his arms, cradling her against his chest as she wept. "No one will ever love you like I do," he promised as she wept in his arms. "And I'm not going anywhere, Hannah. Not unless you send me away." Hannah looked up at him through her tears, seeing the truth of his words in his eyes. He loved her, not despite her strength and independence, but because of it. He didn't want to take her land or control her life. He wanted to build something with her. "I don't want to send you away," she admitted, her voice small but certain. "I want you to stay. I'm just afraid." "Of what?" "Of believing in something that can be taken away. Of losing you like I've lost everyone else." Bryce cupped her face in his hands. "The frontier takes, it's true. But it gives too, Hannah. It gives us the chance to build something new. Together." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the valley in the same golden hues as the day Bryce had first arrived, Hannah made her choice. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, sealing a promise that needed no words. The territorial governor's investigation into Murray's dealings revealed a pattern of corruption and intimidation throughout the valley. Many smaller ranchers came forward with similar stories, and by summer's end, Murray's empire had crumbled. He was forced to sell his holdings and flee the territory to avoid prosecution. Hannah and Bryce were married that autumn, in a simple ceremony attended by neighboring ranchers who had found new courage to stand together against intimidation. With Murray's threat removed, the community began to rebuild itself, forming cooperatives for cattle drives and sharing resources during hard times. Using Bryce's knowledge of ranching and Hannah's intimate understanding of the land, they expanded the Sutton Foster Ranch over the next few years, implementing the improvements they had once only discussed as possibilities. The water rights that Murray had coveted became the foundation of their success, allowing them to survive even the harshest droughts. 2 years after their wedding, Hannah gave birth to their first child, a daughter with her mother's determination and her father's blue eyes. As Hannah sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching Bryce teach their toddler to pet a gentle mare, she reflected on how wrong her belief had been. The frontier wasn't a place where love couldn't survive. It was a place where love was most necessary, where connection and trust were not luxuries, but essential tools of survival. The West didn't take more than it gave. It simply demanded that you be brave enough to risk your heart on its promises. Bryce looked up and caught her watching them, a smile spreading across his face that still made her heart skip. He lifted their daughter and walked toward Hannah, the three of them forming a silhouette against the setting sun that symbolized everything she had once thought impossible: family, security, happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Bryce asked as he sat beside her, their daughter scrambling into Hannah's lap. "About how wrong I was," Hannah replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I thought caring for people out here only led to pain. I thought being alone was safer." Bryce pressed a kiss to her temple. "And now?" Hannah looked at their thriving ranch, at the community that had grown stronger through standing together, at their daughter who would grow up knowing she was loved and protected. Most of all, she looked at the man who had refused to let her face her battles alone, who had seen past her walls to the woman beneath. "Now I know that love doesn't make the frontier harder," she said softly. "It makes it possible." As the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Hannah Sutton Foster knew she had found something rarer and more precious than gold in these rugged mountains: a love as enduring as the land itself, and the courage to embrace it despite all her fears.